Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to share with you guys some of my suggestions of books that you can read when you're really struggling. You've been reading a lot of fantasy books or big books or whatever kind of books in general, and you really need something to get you unstuck. So today, here are 7 books to get you unstuck from your fantasy reading slump. Last year, I really hit a big reading slump. I had read 3 books of the Stormlight Archive. I think I read like 8 Brandon Sanderson books in 1 year, and it was just nuts. I read a ton of other big fantasy books, and I got to the point where I could not handle it. Part of that is having to commit to a really long fantasy series that's made up of really chonker books. It's a commitment, and it's sometimes kind of stressful, even for people who have been reading and loving fantasy for ages and ages. It still can be a bit daunting sometimes, and there is such a thing as fantasy reading burnout. So one of the things that I kind of thought about when choosing these books, I have a few different options for you depending on what it is you're looking to achieve. I have a couple of standalones. I have a couple of more like, they're not YA books, but they're written technically for younger readers, yet I as an adult found them to be incredibly well written and really exciting to read. So I have a couple of those on this list, and I also included I think one book that is not a standalone. However, it is part of what I consider to be an incredibly easy to read, fast-paced trilogy. The first category that I'm going to give you are books that were written for younger audiences but still pack a great fantasy punch. There's a fly in here, you guys. Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. This is a book I read a couple of years ago, and as we all know, Neil Gaiman is a prolific author. He is an incredibly gifted writer. He has some beautiful, dark, thriller flavor prose in a lot of his fantasy work. It's very creature, very underground kind of vibes in a lot of his work. When I first heard about this book, it was sold to me as Neil Gaiman retells the Jungle Book in a graveyard. I don't know if you need more than that, but if you do, this story follows a young boy named Bod who basically loses his entire family in a murder situation, and he ends up escaping. He goes and takes sanctuary in a graveyard where he is kind of adopted by the residents who are interred there. Bod grows up in a graveyard, completely separate for the most part from society until he reaches a certain age. Things start happening. He starts reintegrating into society in a couple of ways, which causes some issues. And we discover that this murder that happened with his family a long time ago is coming back around, and the perpetrator is still in the picture, and it's pretty crazy. This is a great book. As you can see, it's not super long. It is written in a very digestible way, but it still has a lot of those really fun, dark fantasy elements told from the perspective of a young protagonist. It is a fabulous book. As an adult fantasy reader, I loved this book so much. I can't recommend this book highly enough. So that is my first recommendation on the books that were written for younger readers category. The second book that I'm going to recommend to you guys in the same category, I say it's written for younger readers. It's kind of what I would consider in the YA category, but it is not the typical flavor of today's YA, which I very much appreciated about it, and that is The Lost Boy by Christina Henry. This is a very dark, twisted retelling of Peter Pan told from the perspective of Hook, and it turns the story on its head by flipping the hero and the villain of the original story. Now, this book has a little bit of horror flavor in it. It is definitely a huge switch up on the original fairy tale while still giving us the heart and soul of the characters that we have all grown to love in Peter Pan. Christina did an amazing job at creating Jamie Hook, who is the young version of Captain Hook, and shows his origins in how he met Peter and how they worked together for a while and how they were on the same side for a while and what happened to totally destroy that. It is a very fast-paced read. It's so good. This book, I have a vlog somewhere about it, I think on my channel. I just could not believe how much this story gripped my attention. I absolutely love it, and it is absolutely correct in that I will never look at Peter Pan the same way again. Now we're gonna move into the category of, okay, you want a adult fantasy feel, but you don't want as much of it. I have 4 options for you guys here, and all 4 of these I absolutely love. I cannot wait to recommend these to you guys. The first one is The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson. Now, this little beauty is a book that I find actually quite a few Sanderson fans have not read, and in my opinion, it is one of my favorites of his works. I have 2 Brandon Sanderson books on this list. The Emperor's Soul finds a main character named Shy, who is an art forger, and she is imprisoned for forging art, and then she is given an ultimatum that she can either stay in jail for the rest of her life, basically, or she can create this forgery of art that matches perfectly this incredibly old relic that has a lot of power and etc. to it. Now, Shy is such a great protagonist. She has a very kind of no-nonsense way of looking at the world, and Sanderson tells her story in a very candid way, but it still has a lot of that Brandon Sanderson flavor. It has a great build-up. The end is a kind of a downhill roller coaster speed ride, and it is so good. And as you can tell, it is a bite-sized bit of fantasy that still packs a very hard punch. The next book I'm going to recommend to you guys is also a Brandon Sanderson book, but another one that a lot of Brandon Sanderson fans have not read. And this, I think, is my favorite work of Sanderson's personally. Not because of the technical side of things or anything like that, because personally, this book just did everything I wanted it to do, and I can't recommend it highly enough. I rave about this book. And that is Legion, The Many Lives of Stephen Leeds. Now, we follow a main protagonist named Stephen Leeds, who has a rare mental health condition, which is never named in the book, but it basically causes him to hallucinate characters outside of himself. And each of these characters holds a very intense, specific skill set that he's kind of compartmentalized into them. And together, they all solve crimes. This book is not technically a fantasy book. It has a little tiny bit of fantasy flavor, but it is the type of book that I feel like fantasy fans would really love. Stephen is a very endearing character. There's a huge cast of the characters that are made up of his hallucinations. You really get an incredible view of just mental health in general. Sanderson handled it in a brilliant way. And I just have so many good things to say about this book. It has the little bit of faint thriller vibes, but it is a very easy read, and it is made up of 3 short novellas. So again, little bite-sized chunks, great protagonist, incredible concept, and handled in a way that is, in my opinion, really brilliant. Okay, if you can't handle another really long fantasy series right now, but you're looking for a little bit of a thicker fantasy standalone, I have 2 recommendations for you guys, both of which are books that I have read in the last year and a half, both of which I absolutely loved, and both have very different flavors. The first one I'm going to recommend to you guys is The First Girl Child by Amy Harmon. Now, as far as I'm aware, this is Amy Harmon's fantasy debut, and she's written some fantasy romances before, but this one is the first high fantasy. She did a great job. This follows the story of a young man named Bear who is born with special powers, and it's set in a very Nordic-inspired fantasy world, and the characters are fantastic. Bear is basically given the duty to guard the princess of the realm, and because he is very unique, he draws a lot of attention in a world that's kind of tumultuous right now, and it It's a standalone book that honestly, I think I read this in less than 2 days. I could not put it down. Great characters. Amy Harmon did a really good job pulling a lot of heart into this story. Bear is a fantastic protagonist, and his relationship with the young princess that he guards is just beautiful. So again, if you're looking for a standalone that is very good, fast read, good world building, but in a bite-sized chunk, The First Girl Child by Amy Harmon is definitely one that I would recommend. The second standalone fantasy book that I'm going to recommend today is Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Ames. And I realize that I talk about this book quite frequently on my channel, and that is because it holds the record of being my absolute favorite epic fantasy standalone of all time right now. That could change in the future. I realize there's a lot of stuff I haven't read. However, if you have not read this book yet, and you are a nerd and you like fantasy, and especially if you like rock music, if you like gaming, these are all things that you will find. Also, if you like Lord of the Rings, if you like basically any fantasy trope, you will probably find in here. This book was inspired by 1980s rock bands, and Nicholas Ames throws us into this band of older kind of has-been warriors who are all pulled together again because they have to go track down the daughter of one of the members, and the country is under threat from an enemy, and they're kind of grumblingly brought back out of retirement. This is brotherhood, bromance. We have a great, like, every possible fantasy trope. There are hints and nods to so many fantasy greats in this book. It is such a fast-paced read. Again, this is a book I read in a very short amount of time. The humor in this book is phenomenal, but at the same time, it has so much heart that you will be laughing and then crying within a span of about 5 minutes. It has everything I could want from a fantasy standalone book, and I very highly recommend this as a way to get out of a reading slump. All right, my last recommendation is if you're not sure that you want a standalone or something meant for younger audiences, and you think maybe I could handle like a trilogy, but not something that is going to take me a ton of time to read. I want something a little bit more fast-paced. If you haven't read it yet, I'm going to recommend Red Rising. This series is split up into 2 trilogies. The 6th book has not been released yet. Pierce Brown, when are you going to do that? First trilogy is self-contained, and it is, if Hunger Games was made for an adult audience and the stakes were raised by like lots, and it was set out in space, you would have Red Rising. This book is so good. It basically kind of creates a Colosseum-like atmosphere in the first book where a bunch of characters are thrown together to discover the best of the best to lead the armies of this nation. And there's a lot of class system stuff going on in this book. It features an underdog protagonist who really defeats his odds, but at great cost. There are some phenomenal side characters. One of my favorite characters in all of fantasy is in this trilogy. I love him so much. I'm not going to say who it is, but if you've watched my channel, you already know. But yeah, this trilogy moves very quickly. It is a fast read. There's a ton of great world building. It is sci-fi fantasy mix, so there's a really good blend of space technology and fantasy feel and historical feel. It is absolutely brilliant. I can't say enough about this trilogy. I love it so much. And if you're looking for something that might be a little bit more fast-paced, that isn't as big of a commitment as some really chunky, dense fantasy novels, this would be a great one to put in between them. Okay guys, I really hope that that was helpful, and I would love to see your recommendations down in the comments for each other about what books you would recommend, especially standalone fantasy novels. I'd love to see some standalone recommendations in there, but feel free to recommend anything that you want to. Yeah, reading slumps are no fun, and I hope that that was somewhat helpful, and if you read any of those books, I'd love to know your thoughts about them in the comments. So yeah, I hope you guys are having a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.